Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. And along with the Rockefeller Center, we are absolutely delighted to co-sponsor this afternoon's program. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, on an introduction, but coincidentally, just about a week ago, I was in Philadelphia at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, meeting with a very large group of former diplomats and academics and political activists from basically the former Soviet Union. And what we were talking about was exactly the subject of what defines a successful democratic transition. And we spent a great deal of time talking about that, but there were about 4 or 5 questions that came out of that discussion that I'm just going to put on the table today. I'm not going to try to answer them, but I certainly hope that Ron will make a shot at trying to answer them. First, how do you define democracy? Second, are free and fair elections enough? Obviously, these are very important, but is that enough? Can democracy be sustained without the institutions of civil society, namely functioning political parties, courts, legal system, the press, NGOs, everything that we call civil society? What is the role of local history and culture? How do these either advantage or disadvantage the country in its transition to democracy? Can democracy be assisted from outside? And if so, how? The use of force, the use of NGOs, the use of example, standing for principles. How do you do it from outside? And finally, and I think this will go right to the heart of what Ron is going to talk about today, if you do have free and fair elections and the wrong side wins, what do you do? Our speaker today, Professor Ron Shaiko, is a senior fellow and associate director for curricular programs in the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy at Dartmouth College. He also teaches in the Department of Government here, and he has taught at Dartmouth since the year 2001. Prior to coming to Dartmouth, he taught for 10 years at American University in Washington, D.C., and served as a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Politics at Warsaw University in the years 2000-2001. Oh, I see we shared something else. In 1993-94, Ron served as an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow in the U.S. House of Representatives. I did that 5 years earlier. Terrific. From 1997 to 1999, he served as a Democracy Fellow in the Center for Democracy and Governance at the U.S. Agency for International Development. He has conducted democracy assessments for AID in the area of elections and political processes in Ukraine, Slovakia, Peru, the Philippines, Serbia and Montenegro, Uganda, Nigeria, and the West Bank, Gaza. He has served as an international election monitor in Ukraine and Nigeria and is just freshly back last week from being an election monitor in the West Bank and Gaza. So we are very, very fortunate to have the benefits of Ron's insights. And please welcome Ron Shaiko.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken. And I'd also like to thank Andrew Samwick from the Rockefeller Center for making this possible with the Dickey Center. As Ken said, I just got back from the West Bank and Gaza, where I served on an international delegation funded by USAID that was administered by the Carter Center and the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. The team was comprised of about 80, mostly Americans, but a fair number of international observers were there as well. I happened to be able to go to Gaza and observe the elections down there. Of the 80 of us that went to West Bank, Gaza, 10 of us were selected to go to the Gaza Strip. And I was the only American to be part of that team, with the embassy's dislike for that, since they didn't want to have any Americans go to Gaza for security reasons. But I went anyway. Let's set the political context here and also the political landscape of what we're talking about. We're talking about 2.3 million people living in the West Bank region, another 1.4 million people living in the Gaza Strip. Now, I was there in 1996, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to go back. When the first Palestinian elections were held in 96, I was over there for USAID right after the elections, working with the newly elected members of the Legislative Council. And they have dual chambers, one in Ramallah and one in Gaza City. And so I spent some time in Gaza City working with the legislators on just getting things started. So I wanted to go back just to see the difference. What was the biggest difference? Well, a 50% population increase in a decade. If you think of the Gaza Strip, think of the Mediterranean Sea being I-91, and take from here to about 5 miles north of Claremont by 5 miles wide. That's the Gaza Strip. Now put the entire population of New Hampshire in that and add another 250,000 people, and that's the Gaza Strip. And it's a fairly flat area. That is, the tallest buildings might be 9 or 10 stories. So you can imagine the density of the population there. And they're all children. Over half the population in Gaza is under the age of 14. Almost 2/3 of the population is not yet eligible to vote. They're that young. So we're dealing with a very young and growing population. It's not quite to that level in the West Bank region, but it is significant there. So we're talking about roughly 3.7 million people living in the West Bank and Gaza. There are another 1 million Palestinians that live in Israel. The diaspora has about 5 million globally, Palestinians living around the world. But for our purposes, we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza and the Palestinian elections. So there were about 1.26 million eligible voters, and over 1 million of them showed up, a 75% turnout rate. And that was pretty consistent across the West Bank and Gaza regions. There are a lot of different cultures in the West Bank region and in Gaza Strip. And it's probably best to sort of look at the map and talk about the kinds of regions that exist in there and the cultures that exist in each of those. If you think of Jenin and Nablus into the north, the culture of the militia is the dominant culture there. That is, that's where you find a presence of the Palestinian military and the Palestinian police, but also a fairly significant presence of militias, of those sort of non-governmental entities aligned with either Hamas or Fatah or Islamic Jihad. But they're controlling things, basically, in that region. You then go to Ramallah, sort of the center point where the Palestinian Legislative Council chambers are. That's sort of the culture of the elite. If there's any sort of cosmopolitan region in the West Bank or Gaza, it would be Ramallah. Again, a very, comparatively speaking, one would expect to be sort of a desolate place. Well, it's quite thriving, actually. There's a lot of construction going on, certainly not what you would view as a Western city, but a lot of activity going on. Still unemployment quite high. That we're talking about, again, a lot of the political propaganda had it upwards of 65% unemployment. It's not quite that bad, but it is in the 40% range. So there are a lot of people out of work, and we'll come back to that. The Gaza region's even worse than that. Hebron. Hebron is basically that is the lowest point of the West Bank. Is the most traditional, closed Islamic traditional society, and very different culture going on there, and is viewed sort of as another place. That if you're in Ramallah, Hebron seems quite distant and quite different from what's going on in Ramallah. Bethlehem is basically a closed city being choked off. I was in Bethlehem 6 days before Christmas in the Church of the Nativity and was the only person there. The hotels are going bankrupt. There's no tourism, and the new security gate that you now enter into Bethlehem looks like a maximum security prison. So it's a rather desolate place, unfortunately. Gaza is basically the culture of the prison, and it's very much viewed that way. It's an entirely occupied set of territories, but Gaza is perhaps much more so. And a quote that I heard down there is, it's a big prison with a very small window, being the Rafah Gate that's recently been opened. Part of the things that were less told about that opening of the Rafah Gate and the exodus of Israel from the Gaza Strip was that they also denied work permits for about 100,000 people that were daily going out of Gaza into Israel and working and coming back in the evening, and those jobs have been canceled out as a result of the unilateral pullout by Israel. Again, a third of the people that live in Gaza are in refugee camps, and they are virtually totally controlled by the United Nations. On some of the slides I'll show in a minute, you'll see that most of the voting takes place in either schools or sort of sports centers for children. But the UN is basically running the show, and that's what's most troubling about the comments that have come out in the recent days regarding the UN's position on West Bank, Gaza. It's one thing for the US and the European Union to pull out of Gaza and the West Bank. It's going to be something altogether different if the United Nations pulls out, because they are, in fact, providing for the daily existence of hundreds of thousands of people, particularly in the Gaza, but also in the West Bank area as well. They're virtually the only vehicles that actually go in and out of Gaza. When you get to the checkpoint, the Erez checkpoint, you basically take whatever you've got with you. You then go through the Israeli clearance process, which in our case took 6.5 hours, even though we were cleared by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Israeli government. You then proceed to walk about 1,000 meters, and then another 400 meters till you reach the Palestinian side, and then hopefully there's a taxi cab waiting for you to take you elsewhere once you get into the Gaza Strip. So it's a rather difficult situation that's in place there. Okay, so the 80 of us were scattered across, mostly across the West Bank in all of the districts. As you can see, there are 16 different districts up there, 5 in the Gaza Strip, and the remainder up into the West Bank area. The voting system that was used there is very much similar to what has been used in a lot of the democratizing countries of Central and Eastern Europe. That is, it's a mixed system. There are 132 seats in the chamber. 66 of those are drawn off a national proportional representation list, and 66 are drawn from these 16 districts. It was a very close race on the national list. That is, there was a 1-seat difference between Hamas and Fatah on the national list, 29 to 28. It was in the district lists where Hamas did incredibly well and basically received the governing majority of the seats. We'll come back to that, though. So it's a system that's set up that in a lot of ways disproportionately represents different kinds of interests. It's also the case that in those district lists, 6 seats were set aside for Christians. And they are, again, in places where there's Christian populations of some significance. So Bethlehem gets a seat, East Jerusalem gets 2 seats, and so forth and so on. So they're scattered about through. So on a list, you could have had the top, say there were 6 seats in that district, the top 6 vote getters. If there wasn't a Christian among those top 6, you go all the way down the list till you find one, and that could be the 21st vote getter. That person gets the 6th seat. And that was put in place by Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and was accepted by that. It's also, basically, this election was undertaken under, at best, an interim election law and no party law. They have no law on political parties on the books right now. So that was basically, there are no criteria for which Hamas can be judged as a political party, because there's no law that talks about what political parties are or are not. That's one of the first things that needs to be done once the dust is settled and they actually meet in the chamber. Again, it's a unicameral body, just a one house. So it's very much like the Ukrainian model. In Ukraine, you basically have a Rada with half the seats on a PR list and half the seats in that. And they also have a prime minister and a president, so a very similar case there. Okay. The international community played some role in all of this, as you might expect. The concerns they had are obvious. The participation of Hamas, the whole East Jerusalem question, and how that was resolved, freedom of movement to actually campaign for the elections, and then finally violence. The fourth point was pretty clearly dealt with, and there were virtually no problems. In Gaza, while the votes were being counted, the power went off, and that caused a bit of a ruckus, but that was quickly sort of resolved by finding propane lamps and using those for the light. There was a bit of gunfire roughly around 8:30, 9 o'clock that evening when the polls closed at 7 o'clock, but no real systematic violence. A lot of pushing and shoving among Fatah and Hamas members during the day, but nothing of any significance. On the freedom of movement question, a mixed bag. Clearly, there, particularly in East Jerusalem, Hamas was basically barred from campaigning there. And that was the decision made by the Israeli government and the Israeli Defense Forces. The East Jerusalem question was resolved, but for most viewers would probably say not terribly well. That is, there were 120,000 registered voters, eligible voters there, and 6,300 of them got to vote. They didn't get to vote in secret. There were no voting booths there. They were in Israeli post offices, and they had to basically bring their ballot to the counter in front of whoever happened to be behind the counter and fill it out and hand it in. So that was, at best, a marginally successful or positive outcome to that. And on the participation of Hamas, yes?
Who defined a Palestinian able to vote?
Well, that's, the Central Elections Commission resolved that question in terms of whether they use a civil registry or the other registry that was collected by the CEC. And for that, other than East Jerusalem, that question was resolved, and the CEC decided who was a voter. And I'll show you a bit. Actually, we can turn. This is what the voting booth would look like, a voting station. Those three-sided cardboard cutouts were basically the voting booths set on top of classroom tables. And then you had two ballots. You had a national ballot, which was much smaller. It only had 11 parties listed on it. You chose one of those parties. And each of those parties has a list attributable to it, so that whatever percentage of vote you get, you go that far down the list and take those members. So obviously you front load your best people. And someone that was 66th on the list, you'd basically have to sweep you'd have to pull 100% of the vote to get all 66 elected from your party. So that was what ended up in the small box. And in the large box were the district ballots. And that could have, in Gaza City where I was, there were 49 names on the ballot. And that's why the ballots were quite large, and for which they got to choose 6. And in this case, Gaza has a Christian seat, so you had to go far down the ballot to find the Christian. And that was the only place where Hamas actually won a Christian seat. The other 5 seats went to Fatah party. So the mechanisms were pretty clear. The voters understood them because they used the same methodology last year in the presidential election, although this was much more highly contested, and we worried that there was going to be problems. So we were out basically doing a random sampling of the stations within and the centers within the area that we were covering. And we did a comprehensive enough job to be fairly confident that there was nothing systematic going wrong. The first thing you do is check to see if your name's on the voter list, which are posted outside of inside the voting centers. So the center is sort of the larger element, and then within that center there might be 5 or 6 stations, and those lists will tell you what station you're to vote at. Here's what it looked like. Again, the number of 990,000 is about 20,000 short of the actual votes, because this particular compilation doesn't include those votes that basically get lost when you're in a PR system of people that cast votes for people that didn't actually gain seats. So that's where the number, so roughly 1 million, or roughly 75% of the voters turned out. It's the far right column that you want to look at. And again, you can see at the very top are the top 2 vote getters, Hamas and and Fatah. And you can see the first column of numbers are the national PR list. And as I said earlier, it was a 29-28 vote. So if it were strictly a PR system, Fatah could have joined in coalition with the other third, fourth, and fifth parties that gained seats to have a governing coalition. But it was because of what happened in the last column, a 45-17 routing of Fatah at the local level that caused Hamas to have the governing majority of seats. And so they've got 74 seats out of the 132. They don't need to join coalition with anyone. They wanted to, but that was not forthcoming. The first press conference that was held after the elections was by Fatah. And Fatah came out and said under no terms would there be a coalition government, that they were going to be a loyal opposition party. They were not going to join in coalition in a national unity party, which Hamas had wanted. And they were going to simply watch and wait. You know, they claimed the voters had spoken. But as you can see by the numbers, the voters didn't speak very loudly. A majority of Palestinians did not vote for Hamas. 44% of them voted for Hamas, and 41% voted for Fatah. So a fairly close election. But again, this mixed system of representation doesn't necessarily present those numbers in the same fashion. It's unfortunate. Those in the West were kind of hoping that these other parties that are listed up there, PFLP is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Then there was a coalition of small parties, a number of which NDI had been working with, weren't terribly successful. They grabbed 2 seats. The Palestinian National Initiative, Mustafa Barghouti's party, again didn't do terribly well. And finally, the Third Way, which was sort of an intellectual party, the NGO leaders. You might be familiar with Hanan Ashwari. She was the spokesperson for the Arab League. She was a minister in the PLC government and so forth, and a very articulate and thoughtful spokesperson for Fatah. She basically jumped camp and started her own party, but never got any traction. So there were alternatives to Hamas that were basically offering a similar agenda minus the terrorism, and it just simply didn't catch on. That they were the anti-corruption parties just as Hamas was, but they got no traction. They had no followerships. Whereas Hamas had been laying the groundwork since they basically were created in the West Bank and in Gaza back in the early 1990s, of doing the necessary grassroots that would provide them with a constituency of support, whereas the other groups were largely elite NGO leaders or politically elites that didn't really have much of a followership out there in the hinterlands. Again, Fatah was the party of note for 40 years. They were the only game in town. In the 96 elections, you were either Fatah or an independent. So there was no opposition within the chamber. In fact, that was the first thing that we had to deal with in working with the PLC in 96 and 97. They refused to vote because they didn't want to have anything but a unanimous vote on anything. We sooner couldn't get the idea across that it was okay to vote against each other and the government wasn't going to topple unless you voted against the government, which wasn't going to happen. But create a territorial bird, do something to actually cast a vote. So it was rather difficult to get them started. And believe me, the growing pains are going to be equally bad or worse this time around with Hamas in place. Well, what about the U.S. piece of this puzzle? The United States government has engaged the Palestinian territories at least for the last decade. The organization that I do consulting work with has been on the ground in Ramallah since 1996 and has been working with the PLC over the last decade. And there are scores of other democracy programs as well as the other economic growth and other kinds of things. But the budgets are not huge. We're not talking about big Iraq-like numbers. Juan Cole's going to be speaking next Thursday, this time over in Filene on the Iraq elections and the aftermath there. That's real money. This is rounding error to the Iraq budget. So we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. The party development budget in Iraq alone is $100 million a year. That's more than the United States government has spent in party development globally in the last decade. That's how much we're spending in Iraq. And 35 million of that 100 is for security, for the people doing the party work. So this is rounding error. What we spend in West Bank and Gaza is basically the money that you find in the couch in the Iraq budget. So it's not a huge enterprise. But nonetheless, we have to figure out what to do with this. We made some mistakes. The U.S. government made a few mistakes in this. I would say one of the bigger mistakes was the passing of the House resolution condemning Hamas. That probably gave them 5 points in the polls. I was over there when it happened here in the United States, and believe me, first it was that the United States is the laughingstock of what are these ignorant people in Congress doing now, was the view that you were getting not only in the Palestinian papers, but in the Israeli papers as well, because they weren't as forthcoming as even the United States was. The second issue hit the Washington Post the Sunday before the elections, when it was uncovered by a Washington Post reporter that the United States government, through USAID and an entity within AID called OTI, which when I worked there, I was in Nigeria with OTI. It's kind of the CIA of AID is how I refer to it. It's the black box. Office of Transition Initiatives. They have a very small portfolio of places that they do business in, but where they do business, they do business. So in the case of Nigeria, I was there for the presidential election. The totality of U.S. expenditures in Nigeria prior to that election was a $3.5 million HIV/AIDS program. That program budget went from $3.5 million to $125 million in 3 months. OTI did that. They swoop in, they create things, and they hope to make things better. In this case, they swooped in and decided to bankroll a boss to the tune of about $2 million in walking around money. And they basically, again, it actually is legitimate in the sense that Abbas wasn't up for election. The executive wasn't up for election this time around. But it was a rather ham-handed effort to try to get him to sort of create parks and do the kind of constituency services that the Fatah party had a decade to do and wasn't doing. So it was the 11th hour, months before the election, and let's see if we can throw money around to make Fatah look like a party that cares about its people. And that also hit the fan. That also came out in the Palestinian press. And again, the U.S. Fatah itself gets a black eye because they look even further like they're in the pocket of the U.S. government. And so their legitimacy falls even further, and Hamas's grows as a result of that. The interesting thing about Hamas and the followership that it garnered in this is that there's actually a gender gap in Palestinian politics, and that women vote for Hamas to the tune of 15-point differences between men and women. Why? Well, because Hamas is delivering services to their children. And it's the spirituality of Hamas that's very attractive. I mean, they have captured religion in the Palestinian territories. Their slogan is, Islam is the solution, as if Fatah is not an Islamic party or their members aren't Islamic. They are, but it's again, the capturing of religion by one party and the other party stymied in trying to figure out how to do something different with it. And in addition to that, we are the clean party. We're not this corrupt party that's been running the place for the last decade and driving it into the ground. We provide community services with or without the assistance of the United States government, who funds NGOs of all sorts, some of which may or may not be aligned with Hamas. And so they had a package that was very attractive that none of these third and fourth and fifth and sixth parties could really muster up. So there was a reason that there was a connection there. Having said that, the poll that was taken right before the elections that give us some inkling that there was something happening on the ground also said that 62% of Palestinians want a negotiated peace with a two-state solution to that problem. That is not Hamas's agenda, as one probably knows. Their agenda includes the destruction of Israel, the wiping it off the face of the earth. Not exactly a compromise position. The question is how much of Hamas's followership actually abides by that position, and how much of those that got elected on the Hamas ticket abide by that. Now, for some, it's pretty clear. You might have seen on CNN a woman called the Mother of Martyrs. That is, she basically orchestrated a suicide bombing in which her son partook in that bombing. She wired him up. She told him where to go and when and where to blow himself up, and said if I had 50 other sons, I'd do the same thing. I'd have them all go to Israel and blow themselves up. She was on the ballot and she won. There was a rally in which women, it was a rally for women only. I mean, it's key to understand that women are key players in Palestinian politics. They're activists, they're on the ballot, they're built into the process here. Part of those lists, out of the first 4, one has to be a woman, out of the next 5, one has to be a woman, out of the next 5, one has to be a woman. So they built them into the process that way, but women were winning on their own. This rally for women, the women were bringing their young children dressed up in camouflage with mock bombs taped to their chests and parading them around, as if that's really the wish of any mother in the Palestinian territories, to have their child become a martyr. And again, I mentioned that some of the voting booths are in sports clubs. And I walked into one and turned around the corner, and there's this huge 15-foot portrait of maybe a 15 or 16-year-old boy who had martyred himself, had been a suicide bomber. And that's the image that's portrayed to the youth of Gaza. This is what you should ascribe, this is an achievement for you. You can get yourself put up on the wall of a sports club if you simply blow yourself up for the cause. So there's a lot of this is very deeply seated. And it's, again, getting back to that occupation mentality, that prison mentality, particularly in Gaza. I've been calling since I got back to the House and Senate travel offices, wanting to find out how many members of Congress have ever set foot in the West Bank, let alone in Gaza. And I haven't heard back from either. I keep calling and get no response. Maybe I'll have to use a Freedom of Information Act to find that out. But if I had to guess, I'd say the number's pretty small. That few members of Congress have walked a mile in the shoes of the people that are living under these conditions. So it's going to be real interesting to see what the United States government does in response to this. Okay, so we've got these two parties that have basically been the dominant forces. And again, one, a corrupt background of mismanagement, of siphoning off money, of not delivering services to people, and the other party basically saying we're the solution to this problem, and we're also truly Islamists. We are the ones. I mean, the mosque had Hamas flags flying at on the tops of them. The color green that they use as the Fatah party is the color of the mosques. Here's how the seats break out. So you can see, and they're far better than the 96. The Oslo Accords set up the electoral system in 1996, and that was heavily skewed toward Gaza. There were about 9 seats more that Gaza had in the first PLC by population than they should have had. This is a little bit closer to the population, other than you can see the seats in Jerusalem. 6 seats were chosen by 6,300 people. Whereas we go down here to Gaza, there were 8 seats, and there are 500,000 people that live in Gaza City for those. So that's the only real skew took place in East Jerusalem. Quite a carnival atmosphere. I put this picture up first because it also shows you the UN symbol on the school. That's what they all look like, and they're actually very nice. They're very nice schools, but this is the symbol that you'll find on most of particularly in the refugee camps. Basically, you walk the gauntlet. That there was no campaigning allowed inside the voting centers, but outside you basically had this wall of people that you had to walk through to get to the voting booth. And these are the yellow flags are the Fatah flags, and the green flags are the Hamas. Just before there are any questions, we asked permission before we took this picture. That's not something you should do on a regular basis, of take burqa-covered women take their pictures, but they all agreed that was fine. But I think the symbolism is so great in this picture. First, of sort of the notion that you would alternate the yellow and greens, that they can stand shoulder to shoulder and hand out their palm cards, things like this, of basically right out of the American playbook of here's who to vote for. Here, take this, take this. As we were driving around, they're tossing them in our windows so that our car was literally filled up with all the voting paraphernalia of all the parties that are out there. But you basically come in and you walk through this gauntlet of people that are telling you to vote one way or another. But the notion of the sort of the baseball cap on the burqa, and where else would you find this? But they were supposedly limited to $1 million in expenditures, and my guess is they both went well over that, just in terms of seeing the signs and the flags and the hats and everything else. This was a skirmish that took place out in front of one of the booths. But it was very interesting. It's clear to me, a lot of voting is tribal voting. It's family and clan voting. And so you can move yourself, you basically can move blocks of votes. And my guess is one of the elders of one of the tribes of this region came over and just grabbed them by the scruffs of the necks and smacked their heads together and said, knock it off. Because it was dramatic that there was scuffling and pushing and shoving, and one person walked over, and it was dead silence, and everyone stopped pushing and shoving each other. Here's another, just to give you sort of a sense of the height of the city. These are sort of the high rises here, but all of the walls were covered with campaign literature and posters and so forth, and again the flags out in front of this, and so that the gateway into the school would have been somewhere along the middle of that wall. Here's one where there were virtually no Fatah people. It was totally a Hamas gathering. I took this picture. This was, again, inside of a UN school. And as you can see, not too bad. I take it also because of this is a violation, that the police officer doesn't belong in that picture. He doesn't belong in the center. That the police should have been outside the centers. And in virtually all centers we went to, there were police, either armed or unarmed, in there. In this case, the second gentleman in was the center director, and the first gentleman was the station director, where we happened to observe for an hour or so. That was my interpreter, Amal, the first woman. The second one is a Turkish woman who was my partner in observing from Turkey. So she was one of those. And this was the sort of the party favor that we got from Carter Center and NDI. We all were to wear these vests so that we were easily identifiable, mostly by our security force. So if things got, we had 4 police officers with us, but they wanted to come inside with us, but we didn't allow that to happen. They stayed outside the gates of wherever we were. When the shooting started and the vote counting, they quickly got into us, and we said, look, we're safe in here, and we're going to stick it out. So, but they were, that, again, security matters. You got to have it. So all of the 10 of us felt quite secure when we were moving about in Gaza City, at least. So that's kind of what you would find. I put this in. This is what the settlements, the Israeli settlements, now look like. This is out in northern Gaza, totally leveled. There's nothing there. This is the Erez checkpoint. So this is the Palestinian side. You would basically get out of your cars or whatever you've got. This would be where the UN cars would be allowed to flow on this road here. But you basically walk from here into that building, Palestinian checkpoint. You then walk another 1,000 meters to get to the Israeli side, and then you get screened at that point. These were the heads of the delegation. That's Jimmy Carter in the middle. To his left is Ken Wallach, who's president of the National Democratic Institute. To his left is the former president of Albania. To Jimmy Carter's right is the former foreign minister of Spain. And to her right is the former prime minister of Sweden. So those were the delegation heads. And this is a press conference that was held in East Jerusalem the day after the elections, when we all came back and put our reports together. At this point, it was pretty clear what the outcome was and what was going to happen. And obviously President Carter was rather subdued in his remarks, kept them mostly to the conduct of the elections, which again were highly credible. The Central Election Commission did a tremendous job. All their people were well trained, apart from the police presence. And I think that's hard to overcome, that there's a sense of security. having them there, but by the same token, they're all Fatah. So there was some worry that there would be some strong arming going on, but no one really witnessed any of that, so it was relatively nonviolent election and a fairly free and fairly fair one. So it's not like you can say this was a rigged outcome. If it were rigged, Fatah would have won because they control the apparatus. Yes?
Who's in the audience?
Mostly press, and then those of us that actually were part of it. But we weren't supposed to take seats, so we stood and watched. And it was quite an international press. I probably did, during the election day, the European Union had a large delegation there, as did the Canadians, although their presence in Gaza was rather slim. There were 2 EU delegates and there were 2 Canadians. So they decided to stay out of Gaza as well. But the international press was all over the place. I did interviews for probably 5 different European television stations just during the day, walking around that they were traveling with cameras and such, and looking for an observer to interview. Since we were the only game in town, they kind of stuck with us. But in Jerusalem, all of the press was there. I mean, they were really all the American press, all the international press. So the press conference ended up running almost 2 hours, and they only spoke for maybe 40 minutes. So it was quite elaborate. Okay, so where do we go from here? We've got Hamas in place as the victors. None of those parties have sought fit to join in the coalition to lend a hand. They're charged with now staffing out the ministries, choosing a prime minister. The U.S., President Bush and others have weighed in fairly heavily with President Abbas, telling him to stay the course. If you remember, in recent history, when he was prime minister, he quit under difficult circumstances, and these circumstances are far more difficult than he was dealing with as prime minister. So I think there'll be a lot of heavy lobbying on the part of the international community for Abbas to stay in place. He is the hope at this point. He's the only ray of sunshine in an otherwise rather dismal outcome for the West. By decree, when we were there and when I was there in December doing the assessment for USAID, there was to be no contact with Hamas. So we dealt with quote-unquote representatives of Hamas. I am not Hamas, but I know Hamas very well kind of people, which in fact were probably Hamas people. What did we hear from them? Well, the most telling was a briefing that we received 48 hours before the elections, and it's sort of, what does Hamas want out of this and what don't they want out of this? What did they want? They wanted a share in the collective decision-making processes of the Palestinian Authority. They wanted a piece of the action. What didn't they want? They didn't want to govern. They did not want to govern. They were not prepared, and I think that's being borne out in the last week since the elections. That's not something they had taken into consideration when they undertook this effort. So they're in a difficult position. And the most recent discussions with the European Union, the United States, Russia, and the United Nations have basically, for all intents and purposes, have slammed the door on them in terms of future aid. You cannot overestimate the economic situation, the crisis that they're facing, both from a governmental perspective and from just a daily existence perspective. They've got a deficit of about close to $1 billion, and it's only a $3 billion budget. They have basically enough money to pay their government employees for the next couple weeks. There's about $750 million that the EU and the United States has withheld that was due them that may not be forthcoming. And the United Nations is now talking about leaving the region, and that would be truly an unfortunate consequence. But again, these were democratic elections, and it's a very difficult object lesson to learn about consequences. And it was something that Fatah, frankly, never articulated in the campaign. If they had a last grasp, a last shred of something that they could actually put forth to their voters to say, you vote the other way, And life will get a heck of a lot worse than it is right now. We might have been corrupt and we might not have done a very good job, but at least we've got friends in the West. Hamas has no friends in the West. And if they govern, there's going to be a really chilling impact on the daily existence of Palestinian people. What else did they say? Well, they're not willing to change their charter. They weren't willing before. They're certainly not haven't been making any statements to any great effect after the elections on that front. The word we did hear is an Arabic word, hudna, truce. That they're willing to go that far. They basically say the current generation of leadership in Hamas will never negotiate with Israel on anything. Maybe the next generation will, or the generation after that, but we're not set to do anything on that front. But we will sign off on a truce. That is, status quo, nothing happens, no negotiation, no roadmap to peace, no nothing. You stop bombing us, we'll stop bombing you, and that's going to be it. And that's not altogether a bad outcome, given the progress or lack of progress over the last 4 years on the peace process there anyway. Ariat, the Palestinian negotiator for the last decade or more, he was the spokesperson for Fatah the day after the election, and basically laid out this loyal opposition position, saying we're not going to engage Hamas and we're not going to help them govern at all. But in a very bitter tail end of that interview, basically said to the Israeli government, you thought I was a bad partner in negotiations. You thought I wasn't trustful negotiator and a fair and even-handed person. Well, just wait. Just wait and see what you've got coming to you next, because if I was a bad person, just wait to what Hamas is going to do. So, you know, obviously the frustration of the loss and the frustration of what he's been dealing with for the last decade sort of came out there in that interview. But I think an important statement being made that you thought you had it bad then. Well, it's a heck of a lot worse now. So the notion of having a truce that might be negotiated or worked through other parties, other entities, the United States, whatever, the European Union, I think is about the best we can hope for in this situation. Whether or not that's sufficient to have the West step back in and provide some sort of humanitarian assistance remains to be seen. But this is really what Palestine is all about. It's a bunch of children. And it would be really unfortunate if when the day is done, the rest of the world walks away from this place simply because the adults made a bad choice. That humanitarian assistance for over half of their population that's under the age of 18 deserves some sort of recognition by the rest of the world. And the fact that the UN has been in there providing electricity, water, education, health for at least a third of the population of the Gaza Strip and probably a quarter of the population in the West Bank, it seems to me that if they walk away, if the United Nations walks away from this region, there's no fixing it. Or the fix is in the other direction. That if the well runs dry in the West, they've got to look elsewhere for their money. And they're going to look to Iran. They're going to look to places where we probably don't want them to look for their money and their support. So I think we're in a very difficult position. The international community is in a very difficult position, just as Hamas is itself. Hamas has a lot to worry about. It's got to figure out how to govern. It's got to figure out how to do it on limited or no resources. But the West also has to figure out what to do here as well. And simply walking away from a humanitarian perspective just does not seem to be an acceptable response to all of this, despite having Hamas in place as a government. You can do things to bypass governments. U.S. assistance has been doing that for a long time. So there must be ways to basically, you can freeze out the government, you can freeze out Hamas, but that shouldn't necessarily have to freeze out the people that live in the Palestinian territories. So, again, a not terribly optimistic conclusion to all of this, but again, the voters have indeed spoken, but as you can see, not most of them. Most Palestinians did not vote for this consequence. good number of them did, and a good number of them firmly believe in what Hamas believes in. But I don't believe it's a majority opinion that's being held. If there's any validity to the pre-election polls, we know that for a fact. So is there room for moderation? Certainly there is. Plenty of room for moderation on the part of Hamas. Whether they can do it or not, that remains to be seen, because they've got a bunch of really true believers in their positions of power. It's not as though they're loaded with pragmatists at the top. They're not. And they're not terribly, frankly, terribly interested in what the West is doing or saying, other than the financial side of the ledger. So that's why both Fatah and Hamas came out this week and said, don't abandon us. But not willing to make the decisions or at least the rhetorical arguments to make it a little more attractive for the West to engage them. When I left there in December before the elections, after finishing the assessment, I thought at that point the U.S. policy wasn't heading in the right direction. And now after the fact, I'm not so sure about that. That is, I'm not so sure that you need to reward this kind of clear statements against a sovereign nation. And if Hamas can't move off that position, then they deserve to be frozen out. But again, not to the expense of the folks that live there that didn't have any say in this. So one will hope that there can be some kind of position taken and that the U.S. government can funnel its money to the UN and have them deliver it. This is what the UN should be doing and does rather well. And it would be a real shame for them to be pulled out of that situation just because the adults behave in a way that the West doesn't like. So I'll stop there and take whatever questions you've got. Got a microphone? Start here.
Thanks. Professor, I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is, in terms of over the last 2.5 decades or so, you've seen this shift in the Palestinian political parties and the Palestinian political system. Do you see that, and especially in light of how you mentioned that the Hamas won a Christian seat, do you feel that the secular face of the resistance has shifted, and what are your thoughts on that? And the second question is that in Palestinian politics, there's always been this huge divide between rhetoric and practice. Mm-hmm. So in terms of practically, I used to live in the Middle East, so I have a bunch of Palestinian friends, and they don't seem that worried about Hamas's actual agenda. They always say that the military wing is only one part of what they do. And could you see sort of a Sinn Féin IRA sort of situation springing up? So yeah.
Right. Good. Both are good questions. Take the second one first. That's what the hope is, that we can sort of do a Northern Ireland here. We can sort of move people, disassociate, separate out. The problem is that we've been engaging Fatah for the last 25 years, and they've got their own militia. The incident that occurred when I was there in December, the Al-Aqsa Brigade, Martyrs Brigade, took credit for it. That's a militia. That's Fatah's militia. They do the same kinds of things that Hamas does. Yet we say they're okay. They're not on the terrorist list. Hamas is. The other piece of the puzzle is that the Islamic Jihad sat this out. They boycotted the elections. They're still a force, not a Hamas-like force, but they're still a force within Palestinian society. So I'm not that hopeful that you can draw the distinctions here, because the people that are engaged at the leadership level feel so strongly about that side of the equation. If they could simply become the social service party, they could become the clean party, they can sort of do that and still be a resistance, still, occupation is occupation, and you've got to deal with that, and somebody's got to speak to that as a government. But it's the terror piece that's really the difficult one to sort of rein in and get a handle on, or separate out. I'm just not sure they can do that. Give me the first question again.
It was the secular face.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting that Hamas has been able to capture Islam as part of their platform. And that you're right, that Fatah basically has provided, was held up as, this is the kind of party we want to see flourish in the Middle East. It is a secular party. It's got a secular agenda, but it ran afoul of its own lack of competition, that it became a gravy train. It became the place where you went for your, that the select few benefited from Fatah government. And the rest of the folks got this, whatever scraps were left over. And that's something that can afflict any party at any time. But it happened to afflict Fatah at the absolute wrong time. So again, the other 9 parties on the ballot were pretty much that secular, reformist kind of element, and they wouldn't get the time of day from voters. It's rather striking that they just didn't catch on, that their message didn't resonate with anyone, other than the couple of percentage points that they polled in order to get 2 or 3 seats in the chamber. You would have thought that, if Hamas has this 4-point plan and everyone likes 3 of the points, and these other 9 parties are speaking directly to those 3 points, there would be some slide off, but there wasn't. So, yeah.
Professor, I guess what I meant was that even like 2.5 decades ago, when you had even armed resistance groups coming out of the Bekaa Valley and
Right.
things, they were really, really secular, and they still had a large groundswell of popular support. Now, many Palestinians who I've spoken to, who are friends of mine, say that Israel helped fund Hamas to throw off the balance of power, which is, again, debatable. But the secular nature of the Palestinian resistance, what it means to the people, has that changed, or has that re-manifested itself in
Well,
some
it's
way?
certainly been transformed in the way that Hamas is presenting themselves to the voters. You cannot take Islam out of their argument. It's part of that they are part of the global network of political Islam. And this is the way to do it. I mean, the fact that they would run on Islam as the solution as a campaign slogan that was printed on pens and flyers and hats, that's overt connection between that. And the fact that they've got the infrastructure in place, they've got the mosques to actually do the recruiting from. And the secular side is kind of, I don't know what to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Two questions. What do you think Israel's response should be, and what do you think it will be?
Well, in some ways, there's no need for a response. That the rest of the world has spoken on their behalf. The question is what happens in March. Of what kind of impact does this have? Does this make Netanyahu's stock rise dramatically? What does it do for the movement within Likud and others? I don't know. My guess is Netanyahu's a happy camper these days. I would think that he's now in firm position to make his case much more clearly. But again, I think there's a greater deal of pragmatism among Israeli voters than there is among Palestinian voters. So I think that it's, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised at any outcome that comes out of those elections. But I kind of think that Netanyahu's stock has risen as a result of this. Yeah.
I take both. All right. My question is relating to what you think the Hamas victory does for a Fatah leader like Marwan Barghouti, who has certainly more of a militant following, but is still connected strongly to Fatah, and like looking a few years down the road or whatever it is, what does this do for his stock?
Marwan Barghouti is sitting in an Israeli jail on 5 consecutive life sentences for basically terrorist speech. And he led the ticket. He was the top of the Fatah ticket, part of the New Guard. That was how bumbling this process was. The very fact that at the 11th hour, there are actually 2 Fatah lists. They would have been destroyed in this election if they had actually put 2 lists before the voters. Then they would have split their own followers half and half. The president actually, it kind of reminds us of some of the House procedures where the deadline passes and then the clock keeps running. In the 13th hour, a unified list was arrived at. And Abbas basically certified that list as the list. And it basically alternated old guard, new guard, old guard, new guard. And that's how they came up with their national list. But Marwan is the heir apparent. If there were a presidential, if in fact Abbas resigns and they had a snap election, he'd win from jail. He'd be the next president. And the Hamas people would vote for him. I mean, to say that the deputy speaker of the PLC, a Fatah person, was on the Hamas list. So there was a lot of confusion that could easily be seen other than the name. A lot of elderly people were coming in to vote, wanting to vote for Hamas, and they only saw change and reform on the ballot. And they're starting, they're standing behind the voting. Where is Hamas? Where is Hamas? And it was a real difficult thing for the station managers to decide. Do you say, if you want Hamas, you've got to vote for change and reform? Because that was their party name on the ballot. So there was a lot to be confused about when you saw the ballot. You'd say, oh, I recognize that name. That's a Fatah person, but he ends up on the Hamas list. So not that there's a great deal of loyalty. Again, that was the only game in town. And so you sort of, this election was about legitimacy for these people. Only 45 of the original 88 ran in the first place, and only 25 of those got elected. That's why we had a 10-year hiatus. They weren't in any hurry to go up for election because they knew they were all going to be thrown out. So they managed to get 10 years on the dole. The elections were in '96, and we didn't have another one until just last week. So everyone sort of knew in the cards how this was going to play out. So it's a very new chamber. And I mean, the Hamas folks have never engaged in governance before, at least not until the last couple of months. We also have to understand that we've had 4 rounds of local elections in which Hamas has done very well. And they're now running local governments that are working on a daily basis with the Israeli government. There was a Hamas leader at the Rafah opening that shook hands with the Israelis. So to say that there's somehow this blanket line drawn in the sand that there will be no discussions, literally Israel supplies the electricity, the water, and these kinds of things, and draws taxes from Palestinians. And there are Hamas mayors that are dealing with the Israelis right now as a result of those elections that have been held in the last couple of months. There's still one more round of local elections to be held. They didn't manage to get them done before the national elections. But there is a degree of pragmatism when it comes to just providing services, in which in an occupied situation you can't deliver unless you've got Israelis saying it's okay to do so. So on a day-to-day basis, there is a working relationship. They've demonstrated that, at least at the local level. Whether that's enough of an impetus to sort of say, all right, well, we can at least take care of those kinds of issues. That was the dream of Hamas, was to be, again, sharing in that collective decision-making process. They wanted the ministries of health, education, social services, and could have cared less about any of the foreign policy questions. Fatah could have just as easily taken all those ministries, and they frankly wouldn't have cared. So that was their goal in the outset, that they are domestic policy oriented when it comes to what they stand for and what they deliver, because they've got their own infrastructure in place. But now they've got to do it all. They've got to do the whole thing, because Fatah will not help them. And they desperately want to see them fall. They want to see 4 years take place of just abject failure on the part of Hamas, and then they'll sweep back into power. And Abbas has already said he's not running for re-election, so 3 years from now, I mean, that'll be the real telling sign of whether Marwan ends up coming out of prison and emerges as the next president of the Palestinian Authority. I mean, then you'll see, there'll be a clear indication of where Israel stands on the whole question. So, other questions?
Granted that Hamas ran on a pretty strong anti-Israel platform, and as you said, the Islamic Jihad is still out there, and part of the truce will undoubtedly be that Hamas cracks down on terrorist groups. How are they going to deal with that? Because a lot of their constituency will probably be concerned.
Well, I think in some ways they're better situated to deal with that than Fatah was dealing with the Al-Aqsa Brigade. I mean, under Arafat, Arafat did basically 3 things. He could pay people, he could appoint people, and he could kill people. And he controlled that. Arafat's death threw that whole system out of whack. And there were multiple people thinking that they were running the show, and militias out there sort of freelancing on their own. My sense is Hamas is a much more organized entity than Fatah is right now. So if the word is sent down from above, if there's consensus at the top that we're going to reach this truce, my sense is that the message will be delivered and the militia will behave itself. The militias allied with Hamas will behave themselves accordingly. Whereas Fatah, I don't think you can rein them in. I think they're the ones that are going to be the real, because they then have the, they could upset the apple cart by the Al-Aqsa Brigade becoming the chief architect of terrorism. And Hamas saying, hey, we've done everything you've said. And it still takes place. So that's going to be the problem. And again, hopefully people like Marwan Barghouti step in and say to their side, knock it off. That this is not working out for us here. And if we want to come back into power, we need to do something as an opposition party that demonstrates our responsibility here too. So I think, like I said, I think Hamas is a little more disciplined and organized than Fatah is. So I would think if the word is handed down, it would be listened to.
The last sentence of your formal remarks reiterated what President Carter said about funding the area through the UN. And I'm wondering, the UN has been in there for decades funding refugee camps in a way that nobody else has ever had refugee camps. And these go on and seem to grow. And the Europeans have put a tremendous amount of money into the area, and so have we. And I'm wondering what we have gained from this. After all of this, we've arrived at a situation such as we have now, and you're advocating that we continue to fund it so that we support these young kids. But doesn't helping that part of the society bail Hamas or whoever is in control out of more responsible policies?
The fact that we just had a change of power in a democratizing set of territories and no one got killed is something rather different and positive. Again, we don't like the outcome, but that's the underside of democratic development. And there are consequences for that, and the Palestinians have to understand that. You did something on your own volition and have to, in a democratic society, in a democratic world, there are consequences for people's actions, and those consequences should be significant but not draconian. That they should not be basically in a position where you've made something so unlivable that the whole notion of democracy doesn't make any sense anyway. But I think that there's been substantial progress that's been made. I mean, the very fact that the system that's operated for the last 10 years democratized. For the first 3 years of the PLC, Arafat never even gave them the budget. It was a sham. It was a charade. They weren't working on anything. Arafat had the purse strings and did whatever he darn well pleased with it, and never consulted the duly elected people that were there to be representatives. So we could at least overcome that, where there's actually a role being played, an oversight function being played, albeit minimal. It's better than it was. And so the fact that you've got that, you've got a chamber that started out with 88 members and 55 staffers, all of which were beholden to a director general who was never elected to anything. Now you've got 450 staffers and a bureaucratized infrastructure in place that actually can make policy decisions. That's progress, as far as I'm concerned. Even if it's in process only, it's still a democratic process. There's deliberation going on. People are challenging each other. And I count that as a plus. And frankly, the cost of that was minimal in the larger scheme of things. That those democracy programs in total might cost to $15 million over the last decade. That's chunk change in the development world. And I think that's money well spent. I think we do a better job of spending money in small units like this than throwing millions and hundreds of millions at Russia or Ukraine or Indonesia or Nigeria it can actually make a difference when the unit of analysis is manageable. We are only talking about 3.7 million people. You can actually do something there, or at least make lives marginally better than they were. And to sort of walk away from that just because we, again, and most of the people aren't responsible for that outcome. I'm troubled by that, and I think the UN has to rethink its position on this one. Yeah.
I don't know that much about the situation, so maybe that's why I'm confused. But it sounds to me like you're saying that Hamas is both very anti-Israel and interested in a truce with Israel. What am I missing?
Well, they're interested in not engaging Israel, but the bare minimum they're willing to do is say, we'll do nothing and you'll do nothing. And that's better than operating on their budget proactively, or operating on their policies proactively. If in fact they didn't have this idea on the horizon to say we can have a cooling off period, a period of no discussion, of no negotiation for X number of years, is far better than saying we're proactively going to seek the destruction of Israel. So that's about as moderate as I think we're going to get them. And I think the West has to be rather accepting of that position, that's better than the alternative of them proactively seeking to follow through on their policy goals, one of which is the destruction of Israel. That's certainly not one that will sit very well anywhere. Yeah.
But Ron, didn't if I recall from reading, Hamas set conditions for this hudna, and I think you should describe what those conditions were.
True. I mean, I've sort of given you the more simplistic way of thinking about this. That they are not willing to simply say, okay, you're done and we're done. I mean, that all of the other issues of negotiation that have been a part of this negotiation process, in terms of what Israel can and cannot do, what autonomy they can or cannot have, all of these kinds of things are part of that. But again, it's a rather different perspective than the way Fatah and the Israeli government were working or not working together. It's basically not a negotiation. It's sort of it's their version of unilateralism. We've got X points. If you want nothing to happen, you accede to those points, and then we'll freeze it out for the next X number of years. So yeah, I oversimplified, but the very notion that they've got this on their agenda is the glimmer of hope that there can at least be a status quo. There can at least be the end of violence, and to me that's acceptable, given the alternatives. So the question is, can the West influence Israel to say, okay, on points A, B, C, and D, okay, maybe on point E, no, but and then you go back to Hamas and say, you got 4 out of 5, is that enough? They don't want to talk about it in those terms, but you're right, it is. But it's again, it is their version of unilateralism. You can't underestimate how unhappy Palestinians were with the decisions that the Israeli government made on Gaza. It's a slap in the face that they just unilaterally decide to do X. That's exactly what occupation is about. When one side can do anything it well pleases and the other side can't do anything about it, that's not a negotiation. And so here's their version of it. And they've got some oomph behind it. Fatah never had that oomph, at least in the post-Arafat era they haven't. So, yeah.
Did you have any sense of a gender gap in the voting? I'm struck in this picture, other than perhaps in front of the Coca-Cola truck, there's no women at all. Did women turn out in equal numbers to men, and did they vote differently?
Right. I talked about the gender gap on the Hamas side. That they actually went for Hamas much more so than the men did. But again, every polling station had women working there. You can see from the campaigning that the women were out there. Again, it is a Muslim society. They're not going to sort of be out dancing in the streets the way the men are and shooting off guns, so that there is a place for women in this society. But the very fact that you would have them out there in that gauntlet telling people how to vote, telling their neighbors and friends vote this way, vote that way. I think very positive. And the fact that there are a number of very important players in the game that are women, I think some would find rather unexpected for a society like this. So I was pleasantly surprised to find them. They're on the Central Election Commission. They're on every sort of tier of that, and they were out in force. So yeah. Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.